Graham's phone buzzed in the early hours of the morning, its harsh vibration pulling him from a restless sleep. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "She's been seeing someone. Don't act surprised. I've seen you watch her disappear into those meetings. It's not just business, Graham. It's never been just business." His breath caught in his throat, his pulse quickening. He'd always suspected something. Always felt the cold, calculating way Camilla treated him, the late nights, the cryptic phone calls. But seeing the words on the screen hit him like a physical blow. For years, he had buried his head in the sand, letting Camilla's world swallow his own, thinking that if he kept his mouth shut, if he played his part in her empire, he could avoid the truth. But now, it was staring him in the face, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. The message was followed by a photo. A blurry image of Camilla laughing, holding someone else's hand as she stepped out of a downtown restaurant. Graham's heart sank into his stomach. He'd never imagined her capable of this level of deception, even if he'd known deep down that she wasn't the woman he'd once thought her to be. What did it mean? Who was she with? What was going on behind his back that he hadn't seen, hadn't known? As the minutes ticked by, his mind raced, the ground beneath him feeling less and less stable. Everything was about to unravel, and Graham was terrified of what would happen if he let it. If he confronted her, what would she do to him? But if he stayed silent, what would it do to him instead? The stakes were higher than they'd ever been, and Graham knew, deep down, that everything would change from this moment on. Graham's life had always been about blending in. He wasn't the ambitious type, never sought the spotlight, nor did he crave power or attention. Camilla, on the other hand, was a force of nature, a woman with a mind like a diamond edge, cutting her way through every obstacle, using her beauty, intelligence, and charisma to bend the world to her will. And for some reason, she'd chosen him. They'd met when they were both in their 20s, before her meteoric rise to power. Back then, Camilla had been more than just a rising star. She'd been his world. Her laughter, her sharp wit, her relentless drive had been intoxicating. It wasn't long before they were married, and he became a part of her business empire. She needed him at first, needed someone to manage the finances, keep things running in the background while she charmed and manipulated her way to the top. But somewhere along the way, Graham had lost himself in her shadow. Now, in his late 30s, he was nothing more than a background player in the life she controlled. He'd spent the last decade managing spreadsheets, fixing problems Camilla had created, running errands for her without question, without credit. She had a way of making him feel invisible, of convincing him that his place was to support her, to stay in the shadows while she thrived in the spotlight. He had once been a man of ambition, of dreams, but the years had worn him down, and the more he faded into the background, the less he had left of the person he once was. He was no hero, no savior. He was a quiet man, defeated by years of manipulation and empty promises. Now, it felt like there was no turning back. The life he had settled into, the one he had once chosen out of love and a desire for peace, had become a suffocating prison. He had long since given up on fighting back, and the idea of facing Camilla's wrath terrified him. But there were whispers in the shadows, secrets he couldn't ignore any longer. And for the first time in years, Graham felt the stirrings of something that might just change everything. The phone call came while Graham was sitting in his office, alone, staring at the endless columns of numbers on his screen. The quiet hum of the office building was the only sound, and he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be alone in his thoughts. The voice on the other end was deep, gravelly, and unfamiliar. "We need to talk," the man said. "About Camilla. About everything." Graham's stomach dropped. For a moment, he thought it was a prank, some twisted game someone was playing. But the man's tone made it clear. This wasn't a joke. "You're being watched, Graham," the voice continued, sending a chill down his spine. "Your wife's empire, it's not just business. She's laundering money, cutting corners, dealing with people you don't want to know about. And you're deeper in it than you think, but I'm offering you a way out." The words swirled in Graham's mind, his thoughts scattered, a storm of disbelief and confusion. This wasn't possible. Camilla, his Camilla, was untouchable. She was the queen of their world. He'd always trusted her, even when he'd sensed something off beneath the surface. But now, he couldn't ignore it. This revelation shattered the fragile illusion of safety he had built around himself. The man's voice went on, his words cold and deliberate. "You can stay in the shadows and ignore what you know, or you can take a stand. I'll help you expose everything, but it won't be easy. You'll be a target, but it's your choice." Graham felt the weight of the decision press down on him. He'd spent years hiding, too scared to confront Camilla, too exhausted to question her. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, anger, fear, the desperate urge to do something, to fight back. But it wasn't just a choice of standing up against Camilla, it was a choice that would change everything, and he knew the consequences would be devastating. Graham's world was unraveling faster than he could keep up. The revelation from the mysterious caller pushed him into motion, but the path forward was far from clear. He had spent so long in the shadows, so long in Camilla's carefully constructed world, that now, even the smallest steps felt like stepping off a cliff. With the information the man had given him, Graham knew one thing. He couldn't ignore the corruption any longer, but he needed proof. And that meant he would have to dive into the very system that Camilla had built, pulling apart the layers of deception and lies she had woven over the years. It was a dangerous game. He was no investigator, no lawyer, but he had something that might give him an edge, an ally who worked in the shadows, someone who could help him gather the evidence he needed. Delilah. She was a former colleague of his, smart, resourceful, and someone who had left the company years ago after discovering some of Camilla's darker dealings. Delilah had always been cautious, always keeping a safe distance from Camilla's empire, but she knew enough to make her dangerous. They started meeting in secret, exchanging information under the cover of night, using encrypted messages and secure channels. Delilah had the contacts, the knowledge, and the ability to dig through the financial records that Camilla had worked so hard to bury. Graham provided the insider information, the little details, the inconsistencies he had noticed in Camilla's dealings, the hidden accounts and names that didn't match up. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Offshore accounts, illegal transactions, payments to people connected to organized crime. It was a labyrinth of corruption, and Camilla was at the center of it all. But the more evidence they gathered, the more the danger mounted. Graham began to notice things. The subtle way his car seemed to be parked a little too close to his driveway, the unmarked vans that would pass by his house late at night, the men in suits who seemed to always be nearby. Then came the phone calls, harassing, threatening messages. One late evening, his front door was vandalized, windows smashed, graffiti sprayed across the front. A warning, clear as day: stay quiet, or we'll make sure you regret it. Fear gnawed at Graham's insides. He knew the stakes were high. If Camilla found out he was digging, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for anyone close to him. But there was no turning back now. He couldn't unsee the evidence, couldn't ignore the truth any longer. With Delilah's help, he started making plans to leak the information to the authorities. But he knew the moment he made that move, there would be no safe place left for him. The fight against Camilla's empire had begun, and there was no guarantee he would survive it. The pressure started to mount in subtle ways at first. Strange phone calls in the middle of the night, muffled voices on the other end, messages from unknown numbers. At first, Graham tried to brush them off as empty threats, but when his personal space was invaded, when the feeling of being watched became too real to ignore, he knew he was in too deep. One evening, after a long day of digging through more of Camilla's hidden accounts, Graham returned to his apartment to find his front door ajar. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped inside, only to discover that nothing appeared out of place, except for the note left on his kitchen counter. "You've been warned. The next time, there won't be anything left for you to come home to." The fear settled in his bones, but so did something else: determination. For years, he had been the passive participant in his own life, hidden behind Camilla's shadow. But now, this was bigger than him. This wasn't just about his safety. It was about taking down the empire she'd built on lies and manipulation. Despite the threats, Camilla's team wasn't staying silent. A sleek, well-dressed lawyer named Julian had reached out to him, offering a settlement. "We can make all this go away," Julian had said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "We'll compensate you generously. You'll disappear into a life of comfort. No one will know you were ever part of this. Think about your future, Graham." The offer tempted him. He had been living in fear, and the financial security would have been a welcome escape. But Graham knew, deep down, it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about exposing Camilla for who she truly was. The truth had clawed its way out from the depths of his fears, and now it couldn't be ignored. He couldn't back down. Still, every night as he lay in bed, the darkness felt oppressive. He had started to question whether this was worth it. His paranoia was spiraling. He couldn't trust anyone, not even Delilah, though she'd been loyal. The weight of everything bearing down on him made him wonder if he was making the right choice. But then, the thought of justice pushed him forward. The guilt of what would happen if he quit, if he let Camilla continue her reign of corruption, was unbearable. He had no choice now. The fight had already begun. As Graham delved deeper into the web of corruption, the line between allies and enemies blurred, and trust became a currency more precious than gold. His only consistent ally was Delilah, but even she had her own past with Camilla, one tainted by old grudges and secrets. Graham couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Delilah's involvement than she was letting on. But for now, she was the only one willing to help him piece together the puzzle. Then there was Noah, a young, ambitious lawyer who had recently joined the firm and who had been the one to help Graham secure the legal ground to challenge Camilla. He was eager, perhaps too eager, to bring the truth to light. There was a fire in his eyes that Graham found both comforting and unsettling. They made a solid team, working late into the night, sifting through evidence, connecting dots between Camilla's dealings and powerful figures in the underworld. But as the case gained momentum, so did the complications. Graham's paranoia grew. He began noticing small, inconspicuous things that didn't add up. A shadow at the edge of his vision. A text from Noah asking for an urgent meeting, only to cancel last minute. An unfamiliar car parked outside his apartment building one too many times. The feeling of being followed. Then came the blow that hit him hardest. Delilah, his trusted ally, was compromised. One evening, after a particularly long day of strategy planning, Graham received a call from her, her voice frantic. "They know. They've been watching me, and I think I've been tracked. I didn't mean for this to happen, but Graham, I think someone inside your circle is feeding information to them." Graham felt the world tilt beneath him. How could he have been so naive? He'd trusted Delilah, but now the weight of the possibility that someone in his inner circle was betraying him felt like a knife to the chest. He had to ask himself, who was loyal, and who was out to destroy everything he was trying to build? The betrayal didn't end there. Late one night, after receiving another cryptic text from Noah, Graham met him in a secluded parking garage to discuss the case. But when he arrived, he was greeted not by Noah, but by a group of men with cold eyes and hard faces. "You should have accepted the settlement," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. "Now, we're going to make sure you never see your precious truth come to light." The game had changed. Allies had become liabilities, and every step forward felt like a step closer to a deadly fall. Graham had to navigate this maze of deceit, betrayal, and danger, or risk losing everything. Not just the truth, but his own life. Graham had spent weeks combing through documents, meeting in secret with Delilah, and risking his safety to get closer to the truth. But the breakthrough came when he least expected it. It was a late evening, the kind when exhaustion blurs the lines between thought and instinct. He was going through a batch of Camilla's old tax filings when a name, one that had been buried in the fine print of a foreign bank statement, caught his eye. It was a connection between one of Camilla's shell companies and a notorious arms dealer linked to organized crime. Graham had always suspected there were deeper ties, but this piece of evidence was the smoking gun, direct proof that Camilla had used her company as a front for illegal activities far more serious than money laundering. This was it, the key that could destroy everything she had built. But securing the evidence was only the beginning. Graham knew that he would have to present this to the authorities, but doing so would expose him further. Camilla's people were already circling, waiting for any sign of weakness. His own safety, already compromised, would be in even greater danger if he moved forward. Yet the weight of justice pushed him forward. He couldn't back down now, not when he finally had the truth in his hands. The next few days were a blur of preparation, but Graham could feel the tension tightening around him. Camilla must have sensed it too. He had noticed her growing nervousness, her attempts to call in favors, her meetings with shady individuals. The stakes were higher than ever. She was no longer just protecting her empire. She was fighting for her freedom. Graham knew she would do anything to stop him, and he couldn't afford any more missteps. The final evidence was solid. It was bulletproof. But the question now wasn't whether he could expose it. It was whether he would survive long enough to do so. The day of the trial arrived with an oppressive weight in the air. Graham stood in the back of the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest as the proceedings unfolded before him. The room was full, the atmosphere tense. As lawyers in sharp suits exchanged barbed words, Camilla's team was formidable, a group of legal sharks led by the calculating Julian, who had been relentlessly attacking Graham's credibility from the start. But today was different. Today, Graham had the truth. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, called the court to order. The final act of the battle was about to unfold. Camilla, seated with her team, looked unnervingly calm, as though she believed she could still control the situation. Her icy stare never left Graham, as if she were daring him to make his move. The moment came, and Graham's lawyer stood, presenting the key piece of evidence, the incriminating documents that tied Camilla directly to criminal activity. As the pages were handed to the judge and the jury, the room seemed to hold its breath. The air in the courtroom thickened, charged with the gravity of what was unfolding. Julian stood up immediately, trying to disrupt the proceedings. "This evidence is tainted," Julian argued, his voice rising with practiced confidence. "These documents are dubious at best, and this entire case is built on baseless accusations. It's nothing more than an attempt to ruin Ms. Mendoza's reputation." But Graham's lawyer didn't falter. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. These are official documents from international banks and government records. There is no doubt that the accused is deeply involved in criminal activities. The truth has come to light." The judge's face remained impassive, but Graham could see the flicker of doubt in Julian's eyes. The evidence was airtight. There was no way to discredit it, no way to refute the paper trail that led directly to Camilla. As the judge reviewed the documents, a brief moment of silence fell over the courtroom. It was a fleeting moment of calm before the storm. Camilla, ever the strategist, stood up, her composure wavering for the first time. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth, but laced with an edge. "This is a personal attack. My husband's actions are motivated by vengeance, nothing more. These documents are forgeries. The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough, Ms. Mendoza. This court will not entertain baseless accusations. We are here to examine the truth, and the truth is in these documents." Graham's pulse raced. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The walls were closing in on Camilla's empire, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. But the tension in the room shifted. Camilla's eyes locked with Graham's, a flicker of something dangerous passing between them. It wasn't just anger, it was desperation. For the first time, Graham could see that she knew she was losing control, and that made her dangerous. A sudden, tense exchange followed as Graham's gaze met Camilla's across the courtroom. Her lips barely moved, but he could hear her words in his mind. "You have no idea what you've done." Before either of them could say another word, the judge called for a recess. The air crackled with the intensity of the moment as the fate of Camilla Mendoza's empire hung by a thread. Would the truth prevail, or would Camilla find a way to claw her way out of this mess? As Graham stood there, he knew one thing for sure. The battle was far from over. The final confrontation had only just begun. The fall of Camila Mendoza was swift and brutal. Within days of the court's final decision, her world came crashing down. The authorities moved quickly, arresting her on charges of money laundering, organized crime connections, and corporate fraud. Her assets were frozen, her once glamorous empire crumbling as investigators dug into every corner of her illicit dealings. The bank accounts were seized, the properties liquidated, and her connections in the criminal underworld quickly evaporated. For Graham, the legal battle had ended in a victory he hadn't dared to imagine at the beginning. The house, once a prison, was now his. The business, which he had long been a reluctant participant in, was also partly his. His name was finally on the documents, a small but significant token of the years of silent labor he had endured. But even as he looked around the grand, now empty home, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. A satisfaction that was hard to savor. Yes, he had won, but the victory came with a bitter aftertaste. The personal toll had been immense. The constant fear, the paranoia, the betrayals. He could feel the weight of it in his bones. His relationships, his sense of self, had all been fractured in the process. He had exposed the truth, but in doing so, he had torn apart a life that was already hanging by a thread. Graham stood in the middle of the living room, the silence ringing in his ears, and for the first time in years, he was alone. No more Camilla's oppressive presence, no more constant manipulation. There was no triumph in the emptiness. There was only the aftermath, a strange kind of peace mingled with the scars of what had come before. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. A few months later, Graham found himself in a quiet coastal town, far from the noise of his past. The house was small, humble, with a view of the ocean that stretched for miles. It was nothing like the grandeur of the mansion he had once shared with Camilla, but it was everything he needed now. He had no set plan, no grand ambitions. For the first time in years, Graham wasn't living for anyone else's expectations. He wasn't a shadow behind someone else's dreams, someone else's empire. He spent his days walking the beach, reading, and letting the rhythm of the waves calm the tumult inside him. There was a simplicity to life here, one that had eluded him for so long. In the mornings, he'd sip his coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the water, its soft hues reminding him that life could still be beautiful. The air smelled fresh, clean, free of the stale tension that had once defined every moment in his old life. But even as he embraced this new peace, the weight of the past lingered. His identity had been so tangled with Camilla's world, his every decision shaped by her manipulations. And now, as he stood alone in this quiet life, he had to learn who he was without her shadow. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the silence felt too loud, when the memories of the life he'd left behind crept into his thoughts. But there was also freedom in that silence. Freedom to think, to breathe, to rediscover what he truly wanted from life. Graham didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of new beginnings. He was no longer defined by the lies, the deceit, or the role he had played in Camilla's world. In this new chapter, he was learning to let go, learning to trust that even without the chaos of his past, he could create a life worth living, one step at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Graham stood at the edge of the beach, his hands in his pockets. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm soothing, almost hypnotic. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, free from the constant weight of fear, guilt, and manipulation. But just as he was about to turn and head back to his small, quiet home, he noticed something strange, a figure standing at the far end of the beach, partially obscured by the darkness. They were watching him. Graham's heart skipped a beat. He squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure remained still, their face hidden in the shadows. For a moment, Graham wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, if the paranoia of the past months had left a lingering echo. But then, the figure moved, just a slight shift in position, as if they knew he was looking. He took a step toward them, but the figure quickly disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind but the sound of the ocean and the eerie feeling that his past was far from over. Graham's breath caught in his throat as the thought crossed his mind. What if Camilla wasn't the only one with secrets? He turned quickly, heading back toward his house, but the question lingered, gnawing at him. The story was over, wasn't it?